President Trump is warning UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer about the dangers of doing business with China, and he's announced that the US and India have reached a trade agreement and will begin lowering tariffs on each other's goods immediately. Joining us to discuss is Daniel Lacalle, chief economist at Tressis Hedge Fund, international financial analyst, and author of the book Freedom or Equality. Good afternoon, Daniel. First, before we get to the UK-China trade deal, can I just get your quick thoughts very briefly on the latest US-India trade deal?
Thank you, Don. I think that the news so far look very encouraging. A trade deal that would be substantial improvement to the current situation between the United States and India, but also very, very positive for energy because it's a trade deal that would include a commitment from India to reduce quite significantly its imports from Russia and start importing more oil from the United States and also other raw materials. A very significant deal in which the tariff burden would be quite radically reduced, and at the same time in which a lot of the non-tariff barriers of the Indian economy would be lifted. And this is a key element that has been repeated over and over by the Trump administration, the importance of bringing to the table when discussing trade deals, non-tariff barriers. Because if you reach a trade deal with Brazil, with India, with South Africa, with Russia, with Indonesia, some of the countries with the highest trade barriers in the world, and you don't include non-tariff barriers, then you're basically just leaving more than half of the challenges outside of the table.
Okay, all right, sounds good. Let's talk about UK-China trade talks. Some of the agreements include over $3 billion in export deals, more market access, hundreds of millions worth of new investments. I just want you to take a quick listen to what President Trump said about it.
Well, it's very dangerous for them to do that, and it's even more dangerous, I think, for Canada to get into business with China. Canada's not doing well. They're doing very poorly, and you can't look at China as the answer.
So President Trump says it's very dangerous, and we already know China has a poor record of keeping commitments. What do you make of this UK-China deal?
Again, it's the same mistake that the European Union has made with its trade deal with India, is that it does not seem to learn from experience. And we're not talking now of things that we may think or opinions. This is now facts. We know that the previous trade deals with China signed by countries like Canada, also by the UK, have been detrimental to the manufacturing, to the level of growth of the UK economy, and have not delivered in the kind of promise of enormous market and enormous investments that they seem to bring in the headlines. I think that is the big challenge. The big problem, again, with the UK is that it seems to want to double down on trade deals that have been negative for the UK economy, which, let's not forget, is in stagnation and whose manufacturing sector is truly in a very, very negative state. So it's not something that should be boasted in terms of reaching a very quick trade deal just to grab some headlines. They need to be very specific about commitments. And what we know from the past is that those commitments become paper promises afterwards.
But what do you say to this, that the UK Minister of State for Trade Policy said it would be bonkers, frankly, and this is a quote from him, for the UK to ignore the presence of China on the world stage?
No, absolutely. And it would be bonkers to ignore the reality of the presence of China in the world stage. And the reality of the presence of China in the world stage is that absolutely you can reach trade deals, but you need to acknowledge that China does not work with the same principles and with the same limitations and with the same transparency that the UK, Canada, or the United States works with. So that is the problem. The problem is that the Minister of Trade in the UK seems to be in some kind of, surprising world in which he seems to not want to acknowledge the reality, now evidence for the energy sector in the UK, for the manufacturing sector in the UK. China always does the same thing. It promises a very, very, very large market in exchange of turning a blind eye to its completely different regulatory, fiscal, and transparency measures. What happens afterwards is that very, very large market is not that large because the population in China have very, very low wages and they don't consume as much as UK ministers tend to think. Hence, the problem is that what is actually bonkers is for the Labour government in the UK not to admit the fact that previous trade deals with China have been very negative for the UK economy. So they can reach agreement, they can reach bilateral agreements. There is no problem with all of that, by the way. They already have them. I don't understand why they need to reach a trade agreement, which seems to be more focused on giving the headline that the UK is doing something against Trump rather than for the UK people.
Okay, so Daniel, one thing you said is that the Chinese people doesn't consume as much. I'm wondering if you can expand on what the U.S. Secretary of Commerce said. He said that the Chinese are great exporters, but when you're trying to export to them, it's difficult. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think it's very evident. China is one of the countries with the largest trade barriers in terms of non-tariff barriers. It has allegedly low tariffs, but very large trade barriers. To start with, obviously, the fact that there is very little legal security, obviously, industrial protection and intellectual property protection, etc. All of those elements are trade barriers. But there's also a very important trade barriers, is that it's always talking about the promise of a very large market. However, when companies want to actually develop their businesses in China and sell to China, what they find themselves is with three things. Number one is that the average consumer has a much lower income than what they actually expected, and they also have very low tolerance to added consumption. Number two, that the enormity of the excess capacity of the productive sector in China basically makes it impossible for Western companies to compete. And that is something that that Lutnick and other people have mentioned, that how the Chinese government subsidizes that massive excess capacity. And third, and I think that is very important, is that Chinese citizens don't consume on credit. The use of credit cards, the use of debt instruments, the use of loans to purchase goods and services is something that is not in the culture of the Chinese citizen. Therefore, what many companies have found in the past, not many, I think the vast majority of them, is that the alleged prospect of monumental sales in China end up being a very, very thin promise.
That is so true. That the Chinese people, like you said, they don't operate on credit. I didn't think of that before, but it's so true. I want to bring up another angle, which is human rights. Does expanding trade without a strong focus on human rights concerns weaken the UK's leverage on these issues? For example, I'm thinking about Jimmy Lai being released because he's a British citizen, right? He wasn't even mentioned in the readouts in the meetings between China and the UK.
This is what I don't understand as well, and it's a great point what you're bringing up, is that the UK, the European Union, Canada are all the time talking about human rights and about environmental issues. However, when it comes to present themselves and reach a quick, dirty, and very low commitment trade deal with China, they seem to forget all those elements. So it's a little bit almost I would say that it's challenging for anybody that looks at the economy to believe in all of those elements that seem to be monumental and pillars of the decision process of the UK government, of the EU, or of Canada. And then when it comes to going to China and demanding that in order to arrive to those trade deals, there should be drastic changes in human rights and certainly in environmental protection, none of those things are brought up, which comes back to the bonkers comment of the Minister of Trade. What on earth are they expecting? That only by trade China is going to change its policies in terms of respect for human rights and respect for the environment? That is never going to happen if the countries that they reach trade deals with don't actually force China to make strong commitments to improve the human rights situation and to improve the legal investor security and environmental protection measures.
Just finally, Daniel, I want to hear from you. Why do you think this is happening? Because the UK's trade deal comes right on the heels of Canada's trade deal, which President Trump said, you can't look to China for answers. So why do you think this is happening?
I call it a post-Davos tantrum. I think that what happened in Davos was that the US delegation arrived and gave very, very tough lessons and showed the reality of the mistakes made by Canada, by the UK, by the European Union with the wrong policies that have led those economies to stagnation. And then it seems that everybody felt in a rush to reach big trade deals with China or with India in order to sort of send a signal that says we are relevant, we matter. No? Well, no. Basically, you're shooting yourself in the foot yet again, by the way, because this is not a question, again, if we had this discussion, this interview, maybe 10 years ago, there would be elements of debate. There would be an opinion. Now it's not an opinion. Now it's an evidence. It's an evidence that China, the European Union, the UK have completely demolished their industry, their agriculture, their energy sectors, their farming sectors by reaching agreements with China that have not delivered any type of strong improvement for their domestic economy. They have lost in terms of job creation. They have lost in terms of their leading sectors. Think about this for a second. Germany, the global leader of the automotive sector, gave the future of the automotive sector to China with the wrong policies. And now, just because President Trump, like he did with the nuclear mistakes, is saying things that are logical, things that are evident. It's not news. China is working with different rules, and they're not changing. A couple of decades ago, people thought that by trading more with China, China would be opening its economy, opening its freedoms, opening its institutions. That is not happening. The opposite is actually happening. So with that evidence, it seems that they wanted to create a post-Davos tantrum and generate big headlines to sort of show that they're relevant when they have been sort of proven to be wrong in their domestic and foreign policies.
Yeah, well said. And I just want to reiterate your point that we have evidence now that doing this kind of trade with China will negatively impact your economy. Okay, thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.